go. I will introduce myself. I am Jim Gustafson, professor of psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin Medical School, giving my 15th lecture today. Today's lecture is called The Architecture of a Life. I'm going to talk with you today about the construction of modern architecture in the so-called International Style Modernism compared to the constructions of a modern individual life. Something similar goes wrong in each of these fields. The wrongness has to do with not having a center. And the wrongness has to do with depending on only one connection. These are fatal designs. In a sense, there's the architecture of the building itself, and then there's the habitat in which it's situated, right? Two problems of architecture. I chose to, so let's begin with a visit on campus to a typical modern building. Together we'll go and have a look and feel what it's like to be there. And then we'll proceed to visit a common modern life. And on the board there are the blueprints, and don't go there yet, Ed, but basically I've come to see that having blueprints is exceedingly important, and it could be to you too. I hope you'll see why. I chose to visit one of the new temples of the university on our campus several years ago, and I could hardly have felt worse for doing it. I found it to be one big 6-story space with very few partitions, like the lobby of an airport. The access to it had similar steel doors. There was nowhere in particular to go in it. It had no rooms I wanted to be in, and it had no center. I felt so bad in it that I wanted to reposition myself outside of it in order to recover. So I got out my favorite book of architecture, Louis Kahn, who you probably have never heard of, by far the greatest American architect, in hope of deliverance and in hope of an explanation, and I read the following. For inspiration, Kahn once again looked to history and to Rome. If you look at the baths of Caracalla, the ceiling swells 150 feet high. It was a marvelous realization on the part of the Romans to build such a space. It goes beyond function. Kahn called for spaces which have, quote, as much of a sense of nobility as you can give them. If you look at the baths of Caracalla, we know we can bathe just as well under an 8-foot ceiling. But I believe there's something about a 150-foot ceiling that makes a man, or can we say a woman, a different kind of man or woman. Later in McCarter's book, he says and quotes Kahn as follows, and then we'll be complete with our visit. You have a society of rooms, and each one has a character. He's quoting Kahn here, allowing delicate differences to express themselves. In a way, people meeting in them are different people than those who live in divisionless space. The idea that space could be divisionless, continuous, an undifferentiated, free-plan space in extension, typical of International Style Modernism, where space flowed undefined and unrestricted through column grids, was in fact anathema to Kahn. Now I would like to exemplify the radical difference for you, say in Kahn's library for Phillips Exeter or Kahn's Erdmann Hall for Bryn Mawr. I can only point out two radically different positions in these two buildings briefly, which are strictly analogous to our field of psychotherapy. One is that in both buildings move you towards a noble central hall, which is unforgettable. A second is that all of the rooms leading up to the center have their own character. For example, the library has reading carols around its entire periphery in the light, right? Then huge geometric, and then darker space inside of that for the books. Then you come into the great center of light from above, and huge geometric openings looking into the darker space of the books. In other words, 3 concentric buildings, each made of its own different materials. Now we can look at the blueprint I did there on the left. You'll see exactly what I was talking about, the 3 buildings. You see the outer building, which is all light, the dark region of the books, and then the light in the center. And of course, to be in position 2 there is to be in a real stronghold. And of course, to be in position 1 on West Johnson, it's not such a good place to be. In fact, I think Monty Ball got beat up there the other night. 5 people assaulted him, yeah, farther down. Yeah. All right, Ed, you can come back from that drawing. All right, now we're going to go to the second half of the lecture on the analogy in psychiatry and psychotherapy. Now I would like you to consider, and this is your field and my field, how an individual person builds a structure for herself to live in the world. Consider this patient that I saw several years ago with the medical students in their introduction to interviewing. The patient was a middle-aged woman who prided herself on being a down-to-earth lady with her patients as a nursing assistant. Also, she acted that way with the medical students, as you can imagine. Very jocular and so forth. What had happened, despite the catastrophe that she was about to tell them, what had happened was that her gregarious nature was not laudable for the doctors she worked for, who wanted strict and formal procedures to be carried out just so. A day before she attempted suicide, it became clear to her that they were not having her back. That much a pair of students could elicit of her history in an hour. So I had 10 minutes, as is my wont with the students, to summarize and get beyond this surface. So I said to her that this remained highly dangerous because her role as a nursing assistant had become her entire life and now seemed to be over. Now her joking stopped, and she looked in great pain, and I had her full attention. I went on quite briefly to say that she had already told us that she had been in the same situation with her mother at about age 5 or 6. Dependent on one person, right? Same thing. A very narrow design for a life. When her mother had become quite crazy and harsh with her. Very interestingly, that little girl had gone to many other homes in the neighborhood to get a number of new mothers. I said to her, I bet you're not doing that now. I bet no one around you knows how much trouble you were in. I knew that from her act with us, which was convincing, She nodded agreement. In other words, I saw her in terms of last week's lecture as on unshielded ground. That was her horizon, and all she could see was that her project was over. Very quickly, I noted for her that she had very deftly found shielded ground as a child by taking the whole neighborhood for herself. Now let's look at the diagram. That's the diagram on the right, on the board there. That's another blueprint. So you see a position 1 on the right. I mean, she's on a stage there in orange, and you take away the stage, and you got 0. And on the left, and then, of course, after the medical students had interviewed her, we were just looking at that. It just looked like. But then I had heard the history that they'd gotten, and I had heard that at age 5, she had a beautiful diversification of her habitat. All right. Now, the medical students had seen me do this 3 times before in 3 preceding cases, and they asked me how I did it. I said very simply that their questions gave us a picture of a person whose life was at an end. But that wasn't going to help her find it again, right? because it has a horizon in which it seems nothing else is even conceivable or imaginable. So we were getting a view from the outside of a collapsed system. We needed to get back before that collapse to when the patient was not that way. We had to back up the history. And fortunately, there was a beautiful potential already in her, you see, if we were going to be of help. All right, Ed, if you haven't come back from the blueprint, then I'll close the lecture. And always I had told them that the new beginning meant going back to a child's romance. That's true of all of us too, which is the lifeline that keeps the child going. In other words, we needed to go back to the great central room, the world within a world. In other words, this means of deliverance was already in her. Once upon a time, to use a child's phrase, she knew how to reach out to a neighborhood, as did the resilient children in the study of Children of a Garden Island. She had forgotten what she knew and built her house, it's enough to cry, in one unshielded and dangerous place. Thank you.